Today, we will discuss the public-private partnership concept. I will first introduce PPP. I will give you some definition. We'll talk about what are the main characteristics of PPP. We will also ask ourselves, why doing a PPP? What it is and what's not a PPP. Sometimes in the marketplace, there are confusions. Some infrastructure project, we think they can go through PPP. Well, maybe it's better to go through public funding. Some project go through public funding. Maybe it's better if they go through private funding. So we'll explain what it is, what is not PPP. We will discuss the nomenclature of different type of PPP because there are different differentiation in the concept itself. We'll talk about what are the suitable candidates for PPP. Is it the transport sector, energy sector, tunnels, water, education facilities, health, university, prison, etc. Then we'll discuss the suitable content for PPP, what I would call the prerequisite. Then we'll talk about the benefit, but as well as the pitfalls, because some project PPP didn't go well. And I think we need to be honest about it. Some project went very well, some project get into trouble. We will give you an idea why some project would go into trouble. Is it a problem of design? Is it a problem of implementation? Is it a problem of financing? Is it a problem of risk sharing? Is it all of this? Finally, we'll give a quick overview of your country infrastructure challenge and the role of public-private partnership based on the information it was kindly provided to us by your authorities. So that's what we'll do today. So let's start with the definition. Public, first, we can refer to government, organization, functioning under state budget. It could be a public enterprise. It could be a joint stock company owned 100% by the government. Anything public, but until that is receiving some form of state or subsidy or some share of the budget. Private here we refer to profit company, non-governmental. It could be also voluntary sector. We have seen in the education sector some PPP where some voluntary sector are the last P. Then we'll discuss, we have the partnership, which is an arrangement between two or more parties. It reflects the mutual responsibility of shared interests. That's what's very important for me. In all the design of the PPP I've seen in my career, the partnership is crucial. It could make it or break it in any PPP. It builds on mutual trust, mutual interest, win-win approach, and when we have a problem, we have to sit and resolve them in a common sense way. So public partnership allow large-scale government projects, such as road, bridges, or hospital, to be completed with private funding. Basically, the private sector will raise the money. They will put equity, they will raise the debt. They will go to the banking sector. That's where they will raise some debt. They will go to the international organization. They can also raise some debt from there. Or they can bring also some guarantees to ensure that these assets are secured when the PP is done. These partnerships work well when the private sector technology and innovation is combined with public sector incentive to complete work on time and within budget. I think that's very important because the private sector bring efficiency, innovation, different way to look at this project, and they have an intention and an objective to complete it quickly because they would like to start operating it. And this, most of the time, is linked to the objective of the government, which would like to see the citizen of the country receiving the services from these PPP projects, whatever a highway, energy project, water. So here is the interest of the public sector and the private sector come together in the PPP. There is no widely acceptable definition of public-private partnership. The World Bank has some definition. We can see it in the PPP Knowledge Lab. You have reference to it in this presentation. You can go see the link. But I feel that the PPP good definition is basically a long-term contract between a private party and a government entity for providing a public asset or service in which the private entity bears significant risk and management responsibility, and remuneration is linked to performance. So that's an important aspect here. So the PPP is a partnership, as the definitions say, is really two entities coming together within the same interest and to provide a service to the people. PPP typically do not include service contract or turnkey construction contract. But as you will see, I put them in definition because service contract is usually a 3-4 years contract that the public entity can decide to contract out an operator to help them do some work, some activities. They are paid on fixed fees. Turnkey construction contract is also something different. Is I want to construct something, I ask you, public-private sector, to come and give me an end product. Don't tell me how long it takes. I want a product, and I will pay you on delivery, on price per cubic meter, or price per kilowatt, or by kilometer built. That's what a turnkey. But usually these contracts are what we call public procurement project. And probably in your country as well, you have many of them. I did not include in the PPP the privatization of utility, where there is limited ongoing role for the public sector. Because when we talk about privatization of public utility, a change of ownership, you are selling the assets. Here we are talking about a partnership for a period of time, and usually PPP could be between 20-25 years to ensure good rate of return on the investment for the private sector. PPP can be a tool to get more infrastructure service to more people and more rapidly. If they are designed well and implemented in a balanced regulatory environment and legal framework, PPP can bring efficiency, sustainability to the provision of public service, including energy, telecommunication, healthcare, water, PPP, and education. PPP in general allows for better allocation of risk between the public and the private entity. Each party will bear the risk that he can take. And that's a very interesting thing. There are some commercial risk, there are some non-commercial risk. And when we'll go through the discussion of the model, I will give you a bit more details about how does it work. An increasing number of countries are now using PPPs in their legislation. We've seen countries simply putting legislation, defining PPP in their laws, defining the way the PPP project should work. And most of the time, this kind of legislation talk also about the way you have to procure the PPP. But of course, each of these legislation is tailored to the definition of the institutional, legal, regulatory framework of the specific country. We do not suggest one way of doing business that everybody should apply. This is not the case of PPP. We have to be flexible, we have to be pragmatic, we have to be realistic what could be done in each country. So we are not here to give you one size fits all approach. That's not the idea. So in sum, I can see public-private partnership as a contractual agreement between government entity, it could be the central government or subnational, and the private entity established for the purpose of providing an essential service and facility to the public. The goal of this arrangement is to provide a service or facility more efficiency, as I said earlier, at lower cost to end user, so that they get the best deal. And that's very important for us. It should be at least cost solution for the citizen and for the government. The arrangement will try to allocate the risk of the venture fairly between the private and the government entities, based on each entity's ability to manage risk and to provide reward to each party based on the risk they have assumed. As you have noticed, I've been mentioning the risk factor very often so far in my discussion of the definition, because it's all about who assume which risk. And this is an important aspect of any PPP. And that's where even if any government decided to go with a PPP, they still have an important role and responsibility in the way they see the project, what kind of risk they will assume, and what are they ready to put forward to mitigate those risks. And we'll come back on this later on. Now the question is, why should government consider PPP? In many countries, this question, I remember many heads of state asking me this question for the last 40 years. I remember in particular, with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, most of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the new country created after the Cold War, most of the country decided to go with a PPP model or private entities to deliver services. The rationale could be given from different ways. First of all, we all know, unfortunately, the quality of services usually provided by the public entities are not optimal. And this is not only in developing countries, it's also in developed countries. In our country, in Canada, in some provinces, we have seen some public utility not delivering quality services. In one of our provinces, we had a few years ago a water crisis from a city where the service was not monitored properly. So usually the question is who can deliver better quality services? I'm not saying it's only the private sector. I'm saying usually, by experience, the private sector is more efficient and will provide a better service at lowest cost. Risk transfer, what best to do or who does it better? That's why government should consider and ask themselves this question. Performance standard and competition. I don't have to pay if I'm not very happy. I pay upon delivery. For example, in the case of the power sector, if I decide to pay to build a power plant based on a PPP or what we call IPP in the case of the energy sector, independent power producer, I will decide to pay on delivery, on percent or the kilowatt produced, and I can decide in the contract on formula. It could be what we call take or pay. In other words, I have no choice but to pay, or it could be a differentiation of that. So it's an output focused. The main value of the public asset is the whole life. Now, what's very interesting also, when we look at the PPP, it's off balance sheet. So it doesn't have the same weight on the debt side. And when you are in discussion with the IMF, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and others, and you propose a PPP, this is off balance sheet. So it doesn't affect your debt sustainability, all of it as it used to be. And that's an important aspect because most of this organization basically consider PPP off balance sheet. PPP are only one tool that government can employ to help deliver needed service. It's a way of introducing the private sector. It's a way of introducing technology, innovation, and these are important aspects, and the way you provide the services. It imposes budgetary certainty by setting present and future costs of project over time. This is an important aspect for any minister of finance, for any minister of planning, because they need to know what are the costs of this project, what the benchmark if I have to produce project, different PPP, how I benchmark them to each other, what are the implications, if any, on the budget, if I have to provide or to continue providing some sort of subsidy to buy down the cost, for instance, if it's too expensive for the people, especially for the poor, what kind of phenomena you have to think about it. So it imposes this kind of budgetary certainty and it gets you much clearer view and you have better dashboard of what you can, what you cannot. Using PPP as a way also of developing local private sector capabilities through joint venture with large international firms, as well as subcontracting for local firms in areas such as civil work, electrical work, security services, maintenance services, cleaning services. In reality, what I have seen in my long experience working on this sector, any international firm, when they decide to enter in a PPP project, in any countries, they will always look for local counterpart. They will all look for local private sector capability. And over the years, and we've seen it in particular in Latin America, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, over the year, this local private sector was able to become an international firm. In some cases, even some local public utilities could become an international operator and go through PPP project. This is the case of Morocco, a country in North Africa, where the water sector was concessioned a few years ago. For the last 20 years, it was under concession, under PPP. Meanwhile, the local public utility that was providing water, which was the partner of the PPP in this country, developed expertise. And suddenly now we hear that this public utility of Morocco is bidding in a PPP project in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is very interesting. So here the local private sector capability was developed and now is able even to compete with the international sector. And we've seen it in many other countries over the years. So this is not only bringing foreigners, this is not only bringing external expertise, it's also building, grooming, using a system of incubator to let the local private sectors develop and entrepreneurship develop and make it happen. Using PPP as a way of gradually exposing state-owned enterprise and government to increasing level of private sector and structuring those PPP is a way of transferring of the skill needed to national champion, but also extracting long-term value for money through the appropriate risk transfer to the private sector over the life of the project, from the design, construction, operation, and maintenance. Finally, is to set minimum standard for quality of service and legal regulation. That's what is needed when we look at the PPP. Now that I gave you the rationale, the background, the justification, and I hope I was able to clarify some of the doubt you might have about why doing PPP, let's talk about the prerequisite of what could be successful PPP program. First, what the most important aspect, in my opinion, is the political commitment and the political will to continuing and doing PPP. This is a major decision that should be taken at the highest level of the authorities in the country. It should be agreed by the government, by the head of state. That's a major decision. Political commitment. In other words, you have to be ready to say, I am ready, I am attracted to put a PPP program, and I'm willing to put the legal enabling environment to facilitate this to happen. Therefore, an enabling legislation to allow PPP, to allow you to do tax concession, to put some tax incentive is important. You will hear from many experts, don't do legislation. We don't need that. Let's simply write a contract. Don't do it this way. In my opinion, you need to protect your interest, the interest of the country, by having clarity and a legal framework. Because in case something went wrong, we need to have recourses and you need to know what to do. So if you go only by PPP legislation, by the contract that you sign, you might be protecting yourself, but it's not 100% protection. I would always recommend to a country to have enabling legislation to allow the PPP with clarity on the way it's going to happen. The prerequisite also is to have expertise. You do not become a PPP expert overnight. You need to have the best lawyer, the best investment banker, the best economist to look at its least cost solution, by the way, the best technical people to look at the feasibility of the project. So you need to have solid people. And this capacity building is needed, and it could be done very quickly, by the way. Transfer of know-how could be done very quickly. But you might have to hire those consultants. In my opinion, the money that you put to hire those expertise to help you design a good PPP program or a good PPP project will be giving you higher return in the short term. Many people think it's too expensive to hire those experts. Let's do it ourselves. Unfortunately, if you don't have the expertise and you don't know the details, and as we always say, the devil is in the detail, you might get yourself into trouble before even you start launching a PP program. An important prerequisite as well is to start somewhere with clear priorities, focusing on low-hanging fruit. In other words, which are the sectors that could be the most attractive at this stage to do PPP? Because for the private sector who will look at your country or any other country, they will look at the country risk, they will look at the project risk, they will look at the bankability of the project, they will look at what are the capability of implementation, and they will look at what kind of rate of return they can get in this project. So it's very important to have project prioritization, focusing on to improve success rates, and really be clear where to start. Most of countries started with the telecommunication sector. They added then the power sector, then some highway, road. The water sector is much more difficult because usually the rate of return on investment for the water sectors are low. You need also to have not only one project or two, you need to have a deal flow, and they have to be standardization and regularly of deal based on standard contract. In other words, when you start doing those PPP, every time we're not going to start from scratch. The first few deals will be difficult. Your lawyer will have to work extremely hard to design the contract. But once those contracts and bidding processes are applied in some cases, it will be probably easier. The first few cases will be difficult, I have to admit, because you are learning by doing. But as you move in the system, you will see it's going to be easier. This is my experience in a country like South Africa, who's done a lot of PPP program and project. I remember the first few years was difficult. By now they do all the solar, all the wind project on a PPP basis, and it become normal way of doing procurement of infrastructure services. There are risks when you do PPP. Development bidding ongoing costs could be greater than for traditional government procurement process. Some people will tell you it's expensive to do PPP. It might be expensive to prepare the project, but then when the project is implemented, it provides a better service, better quality, most of the time at lower cost. So we should not simply be concerned that at the beginning, the prices could be higher. But the government should determine whether the greater costs involved are justified. A number of PPP and implementation units around the world have developed quite good set of methods for analyzing these costs and looking at value for money. So you can decide if you find it too expensive, you might do part of the project in the form of PPP. But there is a cost attached to debt. While private sector can make it easier to get finance, finance will only be made available while the operating cash flow of the project company are expected to provide a good return on investment, which means the cost has to be borne either by the customer or the government through subsidies. Some projects might be easier to finance because proven technology, we've done it around the world. Some others are much more difficult. Some projects will generate revenue in local currency, like the water project, while others, port, airport, will provide you currency in dollars or euro or international currency, so that constraint of local finance may have less impact. So these are all considerations that you have to think about it. How is the revenue generated, in which currency, what will be the impact on the project itself and its viability. Some projects might be more politically or socially challenging to introduce and implement than others, especially if there is an existing public sector workforce that fears being transferred to the private sector. This we have seen it everywhere. labor union, employees will all get nervous. They have been used to work in a public sector mode, in a traditional government procurement process, and suddenly you are telling them you might have to work in a private sector mode, where the incentive structure is different, the way of doing business different, and expectation also are different. If significant tariff increase are required to make the project viable, or there are resettlement issue, or significant land problem, these are all have impact on how this project will be politically accepted by the country. So we have to be careful. So we have to look and we have to do a good appraisal of what is feasible, what's not feasible, and justify to the authorities, to the people, why we are doing a PPP. Private sector will do what's paid to do, and usually more than that. Therefore, the incentive and performance requirement need to be clearly set out in the contract. It's very important that the design of the contract specify what you expect. We should be focusing on performance requirements that are output-based and relatively easy to monitor. Don't put a list of 30 performance targets. Have your dashboard very clear on what you want to achieve and what you expect from that operation. If the private sector is likely to have more expertise and after a short time have an advantage in the data related to the project, it's very important to ensure that there are clear and detailed reporting requirements imposed on the private operator to reduce potential imbalances. Because what's going to happen here over the years, and those projects are 25 years, the private sector will have a lot of information about the sector, about and which how it operates. And it's very important that your regulator or the regulatory setup or the government itself continue to know what's going on. Because still the government has responsibility vis-a-vis the citizen and will continue to hold accountability for the quality of services. If something is going wrong, yes, you can say it's the fault of the private sector. But at the end of the day, the government, who's the first P in this deal, is also responsible and accountable. And therefore, it's very important to have a regulatory body to regulate the behavior of the operator, to ensure they don't abuse that position, to understand the PPP arrangement, to carry out an obligation within the law and the contract, and make sure that the PPP agreement is monitored and the performance and delivery are done properly. Benefits of PPP are huge. If you gain long-term solution, risk transfer, and in particular, raising private capital. Countries don't have enough money for all those projects. Raising private capital is important. It brings additional revenue stream also. What the private sector brings, quality in the construction, good operation and maintenance, and this is very important. There are many, many benefits, and we've seen it around the world in water project, energy project, social project, health project, education project. This PPP has been going now for the last 30 years. And again, we have seen it around the world, not only in few countries. I remember when I started working in this area in the early 80s, there were only a few countries doing PPP. And we were confusing at that time PPP with privatization. Even in our own country in Canada, we had few PPP projects. But as this concept was developed, as the private sector was seeing more interest and good source of revenue, as well as good rate of return, we've seen now it's become normal. It's part of the normal way of doing business. So many governments, whether in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, now look at PPP as the first step into way to increase infrastructure development. In the United States, this is an important element of any program, of any president, or any party, because PPP bring service delivery to the people, an efficient one, and that's very important. There are limitations to PPP. This is not, again, one size fits all. This is not the solution to all our problem of infrastructure finance. Some projects are not suitable. Maybe sometimes high transaction costs. Then the question, is there a minimum size for this project? So don't pick up small project where the cost of preparation will be so huge that's not worth to do it. Private sector capacity. Are they going to be able to deliver? Political and social sensitivity. And what I call an environmental issue, a resettlement issue. Very important when you do a PPP to ensure it's done, all the environmental assessment, all the social assessment are properly done. If people has to be moved from one place to the other, it has to be done properly, because sometimes PPP also will push you for reallocation of people. Public partnership will have different characteristics. We can talk about funding, we'll talk about duration, we'll talk about output, we'll talk about risk. But the basic features of these 5 broad categories of PPP, which are shown in the figures, each model has its own pro and cons and can be suitable to achieve some of the objective of private sector participation. Special characteristic of some sector and their technological development, their legal, regulatory framework, and public and political perception about the service may be also a factor. So we can talk, for instance, in the water sector, many countries have done what we call a lease contract, affermage, what the French call, and this is usually an 8-year contract. And the transport sector, we talk about concession, and the communication sector, we talk about pure PPP. We talk sometimes about turnkey project, where private ownership of assets is changed as well. So the characteristic could be based on service-oriented, whole life costing, innovation, risk allocation, participant, how many players, long-term relationship, and of course, resources sharing. It's very important within those characteristics, once again, we need to have a clear legal and regulatory framework, which is crucial to achieving a sustainable solution for this project to succeed. Sometimes it's more likely that some party will need to renegotiate the contract. While the characteristics define how we can do it, those characteristics will have also to leave us way to renegotiate some of the aspect of that contract. Therefore, we have to give room and put room for contingency. It's also possible some of the project may fail or may be terminated prior to the project term of the project because of change of government policy, failure by the private operator to deliver, financial crisis. Well, some of these issues will be able to be addressed in the PPP arrangement. It's likely that some of them will need to be managed during the course of the project. So you have to also expect that during the life of this PPP project, a lot of exogenous factor can come and affect the way you do business. But we should start with the principle. If the legal regulatory framework and the contractual arrangement are clear, you can resolve many of your problems through these as legal and regulatory framework. Now let me conclude that session by giving some element of Myanmar infrastructure challenges. I'm not an expert on that sector, but based on the information provided, we were able to look at what kind of situation you are. First, if you look at how you assess general infrastructure in your country, despite improvement, if you look at your country, it's still below world average in terms of delivery of service. It's definitely below all your neighbor country in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of quality of the infrastructure and what needs to be done. So this is an issue that needs to be looked at very quickly. And I think it's very important to keep in mind, if the infrastructure is not built properly, this will have an impact on your economic growth. There is a direct impact between investment in infrastructure and economic growth. So it's very important that we invest in infrastructure. You've gone through rapid urbanization. You have around 10 million people, more people are expected in a large city by 2030, which is equivalent to new cities of Yangon. Large city would likely need to invest $146 billion, and that's a lot of investment needed. So you are urbanizing very quickly. The need will go very quickly. And I think it's very important that as you develop your economy, infrastructure take a major part. But as you develop your economy, it's very important to balance the social, financial, economic model. I will look at infrastructure finance as well as social finance because I don't want PPP to be looked at only from the infrastructure perspective. I believe in your country, there are room to do PPP in almost all sectors. Your country is moving, your country is growing. The business model that you are putting forward on infrastructure or social development and the interest that you are putting in developing PPP is, in my opinion, a very good decision in the right direction. We need to ensure that we build local capability to deliver this project. We need to ensure that we have local private sector that could be nurtured to be able to carry out implementation. We need to be sure that those projects are bankable, attractive, get a good rate of return for the investors, as well efficient service delivery for the people across the country. Thank you. These are the useful links that you can use when you look at this presentation.